Do you want me to hit the record?
Yeah, I've got it. Right. Okay, perfect.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
Yeah, perfect. So good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on which part of the world you're joining us from. We are delighted to have you at the second chapter of DHARTI Speaks webinar series. We had the chapter 1 of the DHARTI Speaks webinar series last month on electronic literature as digital humanities, perspectives from India and Ghana. We had Dr. Kwabna Opuku and Dr. Shanmuga Priya, and we had wonderful participation from colleagues and members from across the world in the global TH community. To tell you a little bit about this webinar series and to tell you a little bit about DHARTI, we won't take a lot of time because today we are delighted and privileged to have Quinn Dombrowski from Stanford with us, who's going to speak on Beyond Defaults, Multilingual DH Meets Cultural Analytics. So I'm not going to take a lot of time on introductions. We are also very happy to have two of my colleagues from DHARTI, the president of DHARTI, Professor Nirmala Menon, and one of our key figures in the steering committee, Professor Arjun Ghosh, who in fact led the DHARTI Twitter conference and initiatives on Twitter for the last year and a half or so. So just to give you a little bit of background on DHARTI, DHARTI is the Digital Humanities Alliance for Research and Teaching Innovations, which is an India-based DH Alliance and DH Collective rather. So what we try to do is facilitate DH pedagogy, scholarship, as well as industry interactions in India. And we have an India-based focus. And DHARTI started out as DHAI, which is Digital Humanities Alliance of India, with which many of us here co-founded with many of our colleagues from across public and private institutions in India. And if you want to know in more detail, you are welcome to look at our chapter 1, where I actually went through all the names. So for today, I'm going to keep it limited and say that we are very fortunate that since 2016, DHAI, and then 2018 onwards, we have been called DHARTI, has been part of the zeitgeist about Indian DH. While Indian DH has existed in different forms and shapes for the last 2 or 3 decades, which is one of the spiels that we always claim, that Indian DH doesn't have the same kind of teleology as Anglo-American DH. The national conversations have been catalyzed, through DHARTI, have been quite substantial in the last 4 years. So we are very proud and we are very privileged to be part of that conversation. And today I can't say how excited, honestly, we are today to have Quinn, because Quinn is a comrade in the fight for multilingual DH that DHARTI is a proponent for, and DHARTI sort of fights for. So I'm going to briefly read a bio of Quinn, which is not going to do her justice, because her bio is much more than this. But again, sort of a brief introduction, and I'm also going to read a bit of the abstract of her piece. So Quinn Dombrowski is an academic technology specialist at Stanford University. She has been involved with digital humanities since 2004, working on a variety of projects, including a medieval Russian database, a digital research environment for Bulgarian linguistics and folklore, a Drupal-based platform for developing digital catalogs for art historians, and the financial papers of George Washington. From 2008 to 2012, Quinn was on the program staff of the Mellon-funded Digital Humanities Cyber Infrastructure Initiative, Project Bamboo. Her article, Whatever Happened to Project Bamboo, reflects on the rise and fall of that effort. Quinn was a co-founder of DH Commons, a directory of digital humanities projects with an overlay journal, and was the director of the DIRT, Digital Research Tools Directory, from 2010 until 2017. She has served on the executive board of the Association for the Computers in the Humanities from 2014 to 18, and I believe is the current co-president-elect of ACH. She's also co-editor of the Coding for Humanists series for practical hands-on guides to digital humanities tools and technologies, and was the author of the inaugural volume for Drupal for Humanists. Her other book, Crisat Graffiti, Vita Accelerator, documents graffiti in the University of Chicago's Regenston Library, and my apologies if I pronounce that incorrectly. Quinn previously spent a decade working in central IT organizations at the University of Chicago and UC Berkeley. Quinn's interests include the old Novgorod Birchbark letters, digital humanities infrastructure, and failure. So before I pass on to Quinn and before I read a little bit about the abstract, I must say that this word failure is very important if you're a digital humanist. And I think nobody talks better about failure and the importance of failure as a digital humanist than Quinn. And in the articulation that Quinn puts forward allows it to make it a very global South conversation where there are huge disparities of technological infrastructure and there are specificities and limitations that make DH a far more rhizomatic enterprise than in the global north. So without further ado, I'm going to read a little bit of the abstract for Quinn's talk today. Again, her talk is titled Beyond Defaults, Multilingual DH Meets Cultural Analytics. And what is it going to be about? Digital humanities methods have seen increasing adoption both globally and in non-textual media, while some DH approaches such as the creation of digital archives, understood in many different ways, and editions have been comparatively easy to translate into different cultural and institutional contexts. Computational textual analysis is often seen as a bastion of mostly white, mostly male, mostly Anglophone scholars with access to expensive computational resources and large textual corpora. This talk will make a case for both the intellectual value and low cost feasibility for individual scholars to apply computational text analysis methods to material from popular culture in languages other than English. So Quinn, welcome, and thank you for being our speaker in the 30 Speaks webinar series. And we pass on the baton to you for the next 45 minutes.
Thank you so much for having me and accommodating the time zone and 3 small children scheduling challenges that are just part of life here these days. I'd also like to congratulate Dr. on your recent submission of a proposal to join the International Alliance of Digital Humanities Organizations, and I hope it'll be the first of many steps towards greater collaboration and exchange with scholars in India. I'll confess I was a little uncertain when I was first invited to give a talk as part of this series, because none of the things I've been presenting on lately seem like they would be a good fit. For McGill's Spectrums of DH series, I tried to give Anglophone scholars working with Anglophone materials in Anglophone countries a sense of what it feels like, not just procedurally, but on a personal and experiential level, to do DH work in languages other than English. And for TextXD, Text Across Domains at UC Berkeley, I did a lightning talk about how language is a domain too, and both for papers and tutorials, the Anglophone people need to step up and name English as the language under consideration, just like all the other languages do. But you don't need to hear this. The fact that there are other languages out there that people might be interested in doing research with, and the fact that it's often much harder to do this for non-English languages, I can't imagine that's news to people in a country with 23 officially recognized languages and 6 officially recognized classical languages. I could talk about the multilingual DH class that I've taught twice now, where all the students bring their own non-English language to work on and we figure it out together. But I'm not sure there's enough about that class that's general enough. There's a lot that's specific to where I work and the details of my job, and I don't know how helpful it would be. And the same with my class on project management and ethical collaboration, which I've been talking and writing about lately. I think there's something to the idea of incorporating simulations like role-playing games into how we teach skills that are, at the end of the day, meant to be applied. But what we do and how is all very knotted up with the current conditions and issues in academia of the US. I could go on at great length about various interesting and fun projects that I've been working on with collaborators, but again, it might be entertaining, but I don't think it would be useful. And if I'm honest about it, useful is really at the core of my professional identity in DH. Having spent my entire DH career, now spanning over 16 years, in staff roles, it's left me with a bit of an unusual perspective. I'm most emphatically not the person you want to talk to about anything theory related. I'm grateful to collaborators who are able to bring that kind of valuable way of looking at things, but what I'm going to be able to offer here is a very practically oriented perspective on some kinds of digital humanities work that are feasible for individual scholars with only a modern laptop and at least occasionally a stable internet connection. Work that has the potential for getting noticed when being submitted to international conferences and that can push forward our shared understanding of human culture, and importantly, work that can be finished, allowing scholars to move on to new research projects or even new endeavors entirely beyond the academy without being weighed down by a sense of guilt and obligation. If you're not sure what I mean, consider some common types of DH projects. While many folks with the official job title of archivist object to how casually and frequently this word gets used in DH, there are a lot of projects that involve building an archive of something. This archive is typically a website of some sort, and there's lots of ways to build websites, some more deliberately and thoughtfully and sustainably designed than others. Typically, these websites have some kind of digital surrogate of some sort of cultural heritage materials along with some metadata, which may or may not conform to an established standard, and either option might be the right choice for the project. And maybe there's some scholarly framing, argument, or narrative. There's variations on the theme. Some of these projects take an explicitly pedagogical or activist focus. These projects can take a great deal of time and effort to do well, especially if the objects under consideration have not previously been digitized. So we rationalize and valorize the extra work. We're not just producing scholarship, we're creating a resource. We become marketers. We embrace surveillance tools like Google Analytics, just like our curiosity about what kind of impact this resource is having and where people are using it for how long, and pour this data into our annual reports in an effort to make this work legible to scholarly evaluation systems that were not designed for them. For decades now, there's been discussion among DH scholars about how DH often means doing double the work or more. A project is all well and good, and you get some credit if you get a grant, but what really counts are the articles and monographs that you produce from the project. This leaves DH scholars at a disadvantage, doing a project and writing an article in the time that peers could simply write 3 articles for 3 times the institutional credit. Clearly, this is not fair, and a rational observer might insist that surely things have to change. And there have been some small progress. Professional organizations have put out guidelines for evaluating digital projects, the occasionally approved digital dissertation, and very recently in the US, Elaine Sullivan became the first historian, as far as I know, at a research institution to get tenure based on her digital project without a traditional tenure book. There's Reviews in DH, a publication edited by Jennifer Giuliano and Rupika Risam, which provides a more traditionally legible venue and framework for attempting to provide credit for digital projects. With a year of reviews complete and more each month, it's undoubtedly more successful than my failed endeavor to do something similar with a group of colleagues about a decade ago with DH Commons, but that's a story for another day. My point is, decades have passed since DH scholars have been saying, surely something must change around tenure and evaluation and credit and the double work conundrum of DH projects. And yet, very little has actually changed. Scholars either find some way to do double the work or make other, often one-off arrangements to get their digital project work to count, or they can't. And if they can't, maybe they leave academia altogether, or maybe they end up in an alt-ac staff position that may allow them to continue their work on some form, but it leaves them with a greatly reduced ability to advocate for the kinds of structural change that would lead to a different result for the next person in the same position. And this feels like such an obvious point that it hardly merits saying, but I will anyway, just so we're clear. The double work burden imposed by DH projects is compounded for scholars who experience racism, sexism, and or the inflexibility that academia is famous for with regard to care responsibilities for children, elders, or other family members or close friends. So in the long term, I don't think the DH double work issue is one we can put off indefinitely. I'm not comfortable advocating for DH to expand and flourish when it demands so much from its practitioners, demands that only even can possibly be met by a small subset of the community. But that, like so many of the other systemic challenges facing the field, is a problem that I, in my staff role, have very little ability to influence. These are battles that have to be fought field by field, university by university, even department by department, and the people in the best position to advocate for change are the senior faculty with the least to gain from that work. If you're going to do DH or advocate for others to do it, it can't be with the expectation that these issues will work themselves out by the time it's relevant for you. Especially if you don't have a stable, permanent, satisfying long-term job, for DH to be sustainable, it needs to be self-interested. Self-interest goes beyond the benefits that you can accrue from the work, although that's what people most often think of first. Part of why the first major project I worked on, the Project Bamboo Cyber Infrastructure Initiative, failed was because we never managed to satisfactorily answer the question, what's in it for me? When scholars would ask us that. But an equally important question that people don't often think to ask about their project until it's too late is, what long-term entanglements come with this project? What does starting this project commit me to? What is my obligation, and to whom, with regard to this project's maintenance and upkeep? It's fun to start projects. It's not fun to end them, especially when you realize that every unique site visitor that you proudly report from your Google Analytics data may represent a real person who will be sad, disappointed, or angry if you don't maintain your project website, and one day it's gone. On the 3-year anniversary of the publication of Drupal for Humanists, my well-intentioned practical guide for building scholarly websites using the Drupal content management system, I wrote a blog post about how websites are like ponies. And more than a year later, I still think I was onto something there. Content management systems make it so easy to start a website, but it's a trap. because websites demand constant feeding and cleaning up after. Not all ponies are the same. Some are fragile, prone to injury, needing constant attention and care. Looking at you, Drupal, with your sometimes weekly mandatory security updates. With other approaches like static website generation, such as the kinds of websites that are often advocated for, in minimal computing circles by folks like Alex Gill and Rivka Risam, it's really more like the giant tortoise of ponies, which can plausibly live for over 100 years without falling to pieces. But it's still a pony. It's a living, breathing thing which you are responsible for. And hardly anyone means to neglect a website pony to the point where the only option is euthanasia, but this happens all the time, as Sean Graham, for instance, recounts in How I Lost the Crowd in his book Failing Gloriously, which is another great read on failure. Certainly it's happened to me 3 or 4 times at least. The heady thrill of starting a new DH project is like falling in love, and asking someone to plan ahead for shutting down their brand new project is like asking people to prepare a well thought out divorce paperwork for the person with whom they're newly infatuated. It doesn't work, and it's not your fault, just people don't work that way. So this is a problem for every primarily website-based DH project, and the urgency increases with the fanciness and technical complexity of the website. It gets even more complex and troublesome if it's a collaborative project, particularly if you hadn't had an explicit conversation about responsibilities around maintenance. It makes it too easy for everyone to choose to believe that someone else surely is taking care of things, until one day you discover the site has been hacked and your data has been corrupted and your server is mining Bitcoin for someone else, or the domain hasn't been renewed, or any of 10,000 other things. And even if you're good at self-delusion about everything probably being fine, having a website that's almost certainly in need of maintenance that you can't give it weighs on you. It can become a legitimate psychological burden. How many people are counting on you to keep the site alive? How much work, yours and perhaps even worse, other people's, will be lost if you let it die? But the demands of the rest of your job and life are often such that you can't make time for it until it's too late. Now, I'm not saying these are unsolvable problems. In fact, as problems go, they're potentially ones that could be amenable to being solved at scale, given enough funding and investment in shared infrastructure and clear delineation of scope and what kinds of projects should be prioritized. But it's just like scholarly credit for DH projects. Just because this is something that is solvable, and surely it can't continue this way, doesn't mean that anyone is coming to save you on the timescale that you need. So, full confession, at Stanford, we're fortunate enough to have a fabulous web services team who continue this, this now tortured analogy, are sort of like the stable hands plus all the stable infrastructure for website ponies that fit a fairly broad set of specifications. At work, if faculty really have to have a website, I try very hard to make it fit within those specifications, and we take advantage of some human and technical infrastructure unlike anything I've seen at other institutions where I've worked. But the situation is more complicated for grad students, especially grad student projects. They won't have access to web services infrastructure in the long term. Also, their interests and plans may evolve. They may find another topic to pursue for their dissertation, such that an earlier project becomes a burden. They may leave academia altogether through no fault of their own. Sorry, my kids have shown up. All right. They may leave academia altogether through no fault of their own, besides the abysmal job market. The benefit liability calculus for primarily web-based projects may be significantly different for grad students, or maybe it's just more acute, particularly in institutional contexts where you can't count on web services to babysit your pony forever if you want to move on to a new project. Web-based projects carry the same psychological burden of needing something that you may not be able to provide. You guys can go downstairs. For all these reasons, the double labor, the maintenance, the sustainability, I've stopped encouraging people towards building websites and taken a harm reduction approach to working with people who are adamant about going the website route. Instead, I've been trying to steer people towards a kind of DH project that can produce peer-reviewed articles as steps along the way. It can be considered done after any of those checkpoints if the scholar wants to move on to something else. It puts data rather than the website at its center and focuses on analysis rather than presentation. Some phases of its life cycle may include web-based display of some portion of the data or some aspect of the analysis, but at no point is there a website as monolith that must be preserved as a complete entity for the work on the product to persist. It's possible to take this analysis and publication-driven approach with the kinds of literary or historical materials that you would typically work on, even in the absence of digital tools. There's a lot of appeal in making that the basis of your digital humanities scholarship because it lends a certain kind of gravitas and legitimacy to the work. After all, you may already be venturing into the dubious territory in the eyes of your colleagues by using digital methods, and you don't want to deal with their questions about both your choice of content and your approach. But a problem often arises with these kinds of high culture materials. It may not be easy to access them in the kinds of digitized formats that you need to be able to do analysis. If you're building a website archive, you can take a scanned image of a historical document or a PDF or a text, post it on a website, and call it done. But if you're going to do any kind of text analysis, it's not enough to have a digital version of the text that amounts to an image or a document that's human readable but not machine readable. You need editable plain text. And if you're dealing with historical handwriting, or frankly, just normal printed Devanagari, to say nothing of Tamil, Oriya, Malayalam, Gujarati, or any of the other scripts of India, that's not so easy to do if you're starting from scanned images. And to go from scanned images to editable text, you need to do something called optical character recognition, or OCR. For handwritten text, it's called HTR, but same idea. In principle, a number of Indian scripts are supported by an open source OCR engine called Tesseract, but it's not particularly easy to use, and even for scripts that are generally well supported by OCR, like Latin and Cyrillic, Tesseract's layout engine doesn't always perform well, leading to poor quality results, especially if you have columns or tables or any sort of complex layout. I can't imagine it does any better for Devanagari. I would love to hear in the Q&A if anyone has had particularly good experiences with OCR for any of the non-Latin scripts of India. What I've been able to find perusing the internet suggests that while there are some options, including at least one funded by the government, they're all underwhelming. Given the seemingly disappointing state of OCR for Indian scripts, it's understandably tempting to give up and fall back on much easier colonial languages and defaults. If you want a language that's well supported around digitization and text analysis tools, you can't get any better than English. I still find it mind-boggling how much brain power from computational linguistics and computer science goes into hyper-optimizing algorithms for various computational tasks on English in order to improve the state of the art from, say, 98.1% accuracy to 98.7%, particularly when there are so many languages that are just completely lacking in natural language processing algorithms altogether. As someone who primarily works on non-English languages and has occasionally ventured into the world of English, I can confirm that it actually is a lot easier to do things. It's like suddenly discovering that someone has changed your game settings from hard to easy. Particularly compared to poorly resourced languages, working on English feels nothing short of magical. And personally, I can't blame anyone for succumbing to the temptation to take the easy path and work with English materials. But that's not the only option. What if, instead of picking a different language, you picked a different set of materials to explore? I realize this may sound odd. After all, disciplines are such a fundamental division in the way academia is structured. Even acknowledging recent gestures towards being supportive of interdisciplinarity, historians should basically be working on history, literature scholars should basically be working on literature, and new media scholars should basically be working on new media, right? At least in North America, though, you'll find that those disciplinary divisions quickly get fuzzy within DH circles. It's not at all uncommon to find a historian or literary scholar who also works on games, or information science scholars working on fanfic, or a Russian literature scholar working on American popular children's books. To these projects that seem far flung, from the corners of the scholars' notional home discipline make colleagues raise an eyebrow? Perhaps. But on the other hand, these projects are certainly not garnering any less disciplinary credit than if the scholar were to work on a classic archive website kind of project. And they have the greater likelihood of getting some attention within digital humanities circles than yet another archival website on a niche topic, even if only because they're different and kind of fun. So to avoid the problems associated with digitization, what if you compiled a corpus of materials that were already available digitally in the form you need? While specialized historical documents may not be available as editable text without you putting in a great deal of effort yourself, the demand for pop culture of all kinds, books, films, TV, and creative derivative works like fan fiction, makes it much more likely that these kinds of materials are already available in a form you can use. Recently, there's been significant steps forward in the feasibility of analyzing videos as videos rather than just looking at textual representations like scripts and captions, thanks to work of groups such as Lauren Tilton and Taylor Arnold's Distant Viewing Lab at the University of Richmond. But for some time now, scholars have developed text analysis methods that, at the core, are based around word counts and are fundamentally language agnostic as long as you can prepare your text in a way that words, ideally, take a single consistent form rather than showing multiple variants like you'd typically find in a language with grammatical gender and or noun or verb inflection, which includes the Indo-Aryan or Dravidian languages, unfortunately. But there are some tools you can use to create a derivative version of your text that will work better with these methods, by lemmatizing the text and changing all the word forms into the dictionary form, which makes it behave a bit more like English, which is what these tools are kind of oriented towards. One thing that following DH Twitter has demonstrated to me time and again is that everyone, even the most august and serious scholars, has subject area expertise they don't typically draw from in their academic work, but is no less deep than the experience they're known for. We're all fans of something. All of us have grown up immersed in one or more cultures, and those cultures were producing cultural heritage materials. And there's some set of those materials that we love, or loved at some point in our lives. I know we usually talk about cultural heritage materials as shorthand for things that are or could be in museums, but tomorrow's museum contents are the cultural manifestations around us today. I remember on a field trip with my oldest kid's preschool class to the Oakland Museum of California, I shuddered slightly to see that the final exhibit was about the 90s, complete with all sorts of artifacts that I remembered as living things, not objects behind a museum's glass case. Odds are good that at least some of the recent cultural heritage materials that you love are available in a format that could be usable with computational DH methods. Popular novels, captions or scripts from TV shows, and song lyrics, the presence of fan communities around all of this media makes it profitable, if only through embedded advertising, for people to compile these materials online with or without copyright permission. I'll note that at least as far as I understand it, there is a law in India that's comparable to the fair use in the US. I think it's called fair dealing. That makes it legal to put together a personal, database or collection of in copyright materials as long as they don't show it or share it with other people for purposes of research or other purposes. And at least in an analysis of the world copyright situation as pertains to text and data mining that I went to this summer, India was in the same category of openness and feasibility of computational text analysis and personal research collections as the United States. So if you gather these materials, don't republish them, but you can gather them and use them. And even if you're dealing with an older layer of media, like films with burned-in captions from old VHS tapes or DVDs that are available on YouTube, there are tools for extracting that text too that perform not nearly as badly as you might imagine. Analyzing these kinds of cultural heritage materials using digital methods, particularly when done outside the context of established disciplines like film studies or new media, doesn't have a consistently used and broadly recognized label, but some people refer to it as cultural analytics. What's really unfortunate about that label, and the title of this talk by extension, is that one of its most high-profile occurrences is in a book by Lev Manovich, a professor at MIT, where everything about his work is big. Big visualizations, big display screens, big data, big budgets. It's actually the antithesis of what I have in mind. Just because you can go big in every way with cultural analytics doesn't mean that it's the only scale on which it's meaningful. There may be some kinds of questions that can only be answered through big cultural analytics, but let's not lose sight of what a single person can do with a laptop, internet access, and a personal interest in material. So as an example, I'll talk briefly about what I and some colleagues have been doing in this vein with a project that we call the Data Sitters Club. So in the US in the 90s, there was a very popular series of books aimed at roughly 9 to 12-year-old girls called The Babysitter's Club by Anna Martin. It took place in a suburb of Connecticut, not too far from New York City, and involved a group of teenage girls starting a babysitting business together. The series ran for over 200 books and was extremely popular with kids, not so much with the children's librarians at the time, some of whom were worried that reading series books like this would ruin children's capacity for appreciating proper children's literature. The culture has changed. Librarians nowadays celebrate whatever kids are excited about reading, but it wasn't that way when we were children. all of us, myself, Rupka Risam, who's known for her work on post-colonial DH, Maria Sachko-Sasiri, who works on children's literature, but more in the vein of fantasy stories, Anouk Lang, who's also worked on more traditional English literary texts, Katya Bowers, who works on Gothic novels and Dostoevsky, Lee Scalaret-Bissett, who works in academic technology at Georgetown, and her PhD is in Quebecois literature. We all had varying degrees of exposure to this series and fond memories associated with it. Rupika in particular is basically a human encyclopedia of this series. And for the last year, we've been applying various DH tools and methods to these books and writing up the whole process in a colloquial, accessible manner. Now, that last part is on us. We were less interested in trying to get publications or conference talks or credit out of this project than we were in creating a guide for how to do text analysis that was more understandable and relatable for people without a computational background, but who may likewise have fond memories of this series or books like it. But we could well have been writing articles looking at the reuse of formulaic character descriptions in these texts, or the use of capitalist language in children's books, or the challenges to linguistic innovation in children's literature. There was a cluster of books where they attempted to introduce new slang terms, but it only lasted a couple books before they gave up and reverted to a more normal sounding English. Granted, due to a very particular and annoying US law that specifically makes it illegal to crack the digital rights management encryption on legally purchased ebooks, even if you're doing it for legitimate research purposes, we'd have to scan an OCR corpus. And that did take some time, but it was possible, especially since we were working with the Latin alphabet. But everything we've done on our own laptops. And other than a little bit of starter funding to buy the books, courtesy of Mark Algie Hewitt's Stanford Literary Lab, with which the project is affiliated, we've had no grants or funding. We're just a group of childhood readers of these books, drawing on our collective deep knowledge of the corpus to help us make sense of the results that we get from applying computational analysis methods to the text, using our laptops with web-based tools like Voyant, downloadable software like AntConc, and other methods using Python code. Now, please don't get the idea that you should just take up this kind of work without consulting the scholarship people working within those disciplines. We've been very fortunate to have Maria on the team because even though this particular kind of children's literature isn't what she primarily works on, she's grounded in that discipline and can tell us that when we've made exciting discoveries that are wholly unremarkable in the context of children's literature. Like when we found out there have been some minor content changes between the original editions and later re-releases. This is a thing that happens all the time in children's books. There are scholars in India who've been doing important work on fields that may intersect with cultural analytics projects, like Professor Rukmini Pandey's book, Squee from the Margins, Fandom and Race, one of the first books to directly confront the issues of race and racism in fan studies. There's a history of cringe-inducing work resulting from scientists, including data scientists, deciding that the humanities look pretty easy and applying computational methods to cultural heritage data without factoring in all the kinds of considerations around origin, context, and biases that are the things we tend to start with in the humanities. Obviously, don't do that. But still, I think there's a place for scholars to use digital humanities methods in order to make interdisciplinary contributions to a field they're not necessarily specialists in. It's not uncommon for literary scholars to make broad claims based on their experience with a certain set of exemplars. DH methods allow us to take a bigger picture view and test those claims. Richard So's very recent work, Redlining Culture, puts the common wisdom of increasing diversity in American publishing and award recipients to the test by looking at the publication statistics from the publisher Random House, which had a reputation for its diverse authors, and finds instead that Black authors reliably make up that white authors make up 97% of the authors published there between 1950 and 2000. Save a small increase when Toni Morrison worked as an editor, which quickly reverted upon her departure. It's a beautiful example of exactly the kind of work I have in mind. Instead of putting together a web-based catalog of all the books that were published by Random House with fields denoting topic, author, race, and other kinds of metadata that we're used to seeing in web-based archives, So gathered a data set and analyzed it to make an argument, specifically pushing back against an established narrative in the field of English literary studies. A lot of claims get made in English literary studies, and I imagine US-centric media studies and other fields that basically treat the English language or American or British culture as a good enough proxy for language, literature, or culture writ large. DH work on English can be particularly susceptible to this temptation to make big claims after looking at what is, from a literary perspective, big data, or at least data on a scale vastly bigger than what scholars in those fields traditionally look at. But after all, English is a single language, or maybe multiple languages, depending on how you define it. And Anglophone culture isn't the only culture. Another project I've worked on through the Literary Lab, along with 3 grad students at Stanford, Steele Doris, Masha Gorshkova, and Antonia Lenzo, looks at metadata that authors of Harry Potter fanfic assign to their work across 4 different fanfic archives, 2 international, but fundamentally Anglo-predominant archives, the older fanfiction.net and the more recent AO3 archive of our own, along with a Russian fanfic archive and an Italian fanfic archive. And even though what we found in terms of previous scholarship about fanfic in Italian and Russian suggested that fanfic is basically all the same, regardless of the language or country of origin, what we found was that actually, and not surprisingly, they're meaningfully different. Each archive site has its own culture, its own rules, some of which explicitly reference the laws in the archive's country of origin. There were some major differences in what tags, genres, and categories were even available for people to use, and a single character could attract different levels of authorial interest across the different archives. Also, Russian and Italian language fanfic posted to international archives more closely resembled the cultural profiles of those archives than other work in Russian or Italian published to those the language archives that they were associated with. And work like this doesn't just undermine claims of cultural uniformity, it also brings into question the degree to which scholars who only look at data from English can make universalizing claims based on what they've seen, even across large corpora. It doesn't always have to be combative, although I'll confess sometimes it's satisfying to pop a hole in claims based only on English. You can also take existing work that's more modest in its claims and see how the same phenomena play out in other contexts. For instance, Ted Underwood's work on authorial gender versus gendered characters in novels. There's no universalizing claims about how literature works, but seeing studies like that on English always makes me curious to see how similar or different the situation is in other literatures. But this is where the discrepancy between NLP tools for English and basically any other language come to the fore. What may be a few easy lines of code for English may require a major investment in developing new algorithms if you're working on Bengali, or at a minimum, annotating text in order to train models. If it's any consolation, scholars who work on English sometimes need to do this too. David Bamman's LitBank project, where he and his team annotated excerpts from literary texts for entities, including named entities, unnamed entities, like her brother. A model trained with the LitBank annotations performed much better when applied to new literary texts compared to the widely used entity recognition packages that are typically trained on newspapers and or Wikipedia. But depending on the language you're working on and the task at hand, whether it's quote detection, co-reference resolution to link up all the pronouns to the characters that they're referring to, part of speech tagging, dependency parsing, like to see which characters are doing which kinds of verbs, pursuing comparable research questions may require putting in a truly uncomparable amount of work towards building the necessary tools. Of course, also not all work needs to be comparative. Basing your work on what's been done on English can be a useful starting place, but ultimately it limits your imagination and ability to answer the questions that are most interesting related to your particular language. At a hackathon I organized last year around Russian natural language processing for literature, some of the things that participants got excited about, the prospect of working on included various forms of the diminutive, both with names and with nouns, and also the use of informal versus formal pronouns. These aren't nearly as prominent where they exist at all in English as they are in Russian, and it's worth building tools that make it possible to answer the questions that are particular about those linguistic and literary features too. Expanding the tooling available to do this kind of scholarship is a lot of work. On the upside, it's work that you may be able to find some interested collaborators for in computational linguistics, computer science, or in industry. But sometimes what you need isn't the right kind of interesting for those folks. They often need new algorithms, and annotated data to implement or improve existing algorithms might not be interesting enough. At the same time, it's not as if humanists have a reputation for being afraid of work, especially tedious work. One of the challenges I've often faced with the scholars I've worked with is I have to make them stop doing things manually, like reformatting texts or copying and pasting things, assuring them that really I can automate this. They should spend their time on more meaningful work. It's not unusual to put a huge amount of time into these archive websites in the spirit and with the hope that someone else will be able to reuse it. So if you're willing to pour that work into a website, why not direct that towards an annotated data set or a code library that could more conclusively be finished and reused? And realistically, you might be able to get a paper or at least a conference talk out of before you even begin addressing your actual research question, assuming you give it a humanistic spin rather than a hardcore computer science approach. So credit of some sort every step of the way if you can manage it. Which brings me to my final point, thinking about the role that grants play in all this. It may not be feasible to get grants with this work, especially if it deviates far from the field you work in. If you're a Sanskrit scholar with a side DH project looking at 90s Bhangra hits, that could be a hard sell. And those are the cases where it really helps to be working on a topic that you're personally interested and invested in. I'd happily spend hours annotating Babysitter's Club books, but it would be a lot less happy if it was Goosebumps, another series popular at the time. But when money is an option, I feel like it goes further when directed towards people rather than things, assuming everyone's got a basic level of things covered like adequate laptops. A fancy computer lab and giant display wall have utility for some kinds of projects and make for great optics in front of colleagues and university administration, but in most cases they'll do a whole lot less to contribute not only to your project, but to others' future work than paying people. Pay them to write algorithms, pay them to help with annotation, pay them to work as project managers. If a student has an interesting idea for a project of their own, help them out with a small amount of funding to get started, like the Literary Lab did for the Data Sitters Club. Pay someone to organize a workshop or other training event. Investing in people rather than things will get you a lot further. It's an investment in a broader scholarly ecosystem. Even, or maybe especially, investing in people whose life paths take them in some direction other than academia, because that's not the only place where people can do this kind of work and contribute to our collective understanding of cultural heritage. And I'd like to end this talk on that note of looking towards the future. Last quarter, when I taught my non-English DH class, I had a bunch of mid to late stage grad students and one undergraduate named Hong Vo, who was in her first year of college, from her parents' house, of course, because of the pandemic. The grad students did impressive work, but it was on the kinds of things that you would expect, given the program they were in and their current or intended dissertation topics. But Hong was a native speaker of Vietnamese who had a side job translating captions from Chinese anime episodes into Vietnamese. And when I asked the students to propose a project, she wanted to capture those burned in Chinese and Vietnamese anime subtitles and turn them into a corpus for text analysis. I was totally caught off guard, being used to the kinds of book-oriented projects the grad students come up with. But her project ended up being the boldest of anyone that quarter, because she hadn't absorbed all the messaging that you quickly pick up at a university about what kinds of things are valued and treated as worthy to be studied. So we did it. Well, sort of. The font in the Vietnamese text made it almost impossible to capture, but the Chinese wasn't terrible. And I've seen this go well elsewhere too. Elisa Becerra-Bonda's undergraduate students at the University of Pittsburgh at Greensburg did similarly impressive things in a cultural analytics framework where they drew upon subject area expertise from their own media exposure and interests. What might DH look like where we value students' pop culture knowledge as expertise in a particular kind of cultural heritage? Where we don't second guess the languages they want to work in, even if we can't read or speak them ourselves, and we work with them to navigate an uneven landscape of tool options. What if more people extended that same generosity to themselves, permitting themselves one corner of their scholarship where they allow themselves to have fun and work on something they simply enjoy, regardless of what others think of its academic seriousness? What if, instead of smiling and nodding at universalizing claims from Anglophone scholars, more people interjected? Could we make English just another language, and one that's been overdone at that, and offer a compelling panoply of other narratives, questions, and challenges? What might it look like to build meaningful community internationally in ways that acknowledge and accommodate challenges associated with funding, caregiving, and travel, pandemic or no? That's a future I'd like to see for multilingual DH and cultural analytics, and what I hope to contribute to in the ways that I can from my own staff role at Stanford. Thank you.
Hi, Quinn. That was absolutely amazing. There's so many questions that I have, so many points that I've noted down, and we have a lot of questions from the attendees. Just a point to the attendees, in case you feel that you've not been able to put your question answer in the chat, I'm happy to promote you to panelist, or promote is the wrong word, or just assign you as a panelist if you want to ask questions directly to Quinn. But for now, I will be turning it over to Professor Arjun Ghosh, who's our discussant. But before I do that, there's just a particular quote that I wrote down in case I don't miss it. When you're talking about Lev Manovich and his work of cultural analytics, which is obviously one of the main normative understandings of cultural analytics, you said that just because the norm for cultural analytics is big funded infrastructures and projects, it doesn't make it the only path for meaningful DH work. And that's such a substantial and heavy and important commentary on DH work. So Professor Ghosh, if you are here as a discussant, I would request you, I will request you to start the conversation, and then I'll move on to other questions in the chat box as well. Over to you.
Thank you, Dibyaditi. I hope you can hear me. I think this is fantastic. The range that Quinn, and with her experience, I think it's very important for us to understand what she has taken us through, the various challenges, as well as the strategies that one can have to actually and this is very important for us here in India and for Dharti, because we are still trying to build a culture around DH, and therefore this is very, very important, kind of foundational sort of conversation that we are engaged in this evening. If I've understood the way I have understood Quinn's work is that what she has just said is she has taken us through various kinds of DH work that have counted as DH work. And she has also sort of put forward the challenges that are there before DH scholars, within the institutional framework that we have to have a conversation with various committees. And she talked about tenure. And therefore, the question really is what counts as DH work? And therefore, I think the important strategy is that in order to, and she took us through that very important, interesting project on, quite fascinating project on the Data Sitters Club. I was getting reminded of the various children's magazines that we used to read as kids, and they're still lying in our backyard somewhere. And so this is something very relatable, is the fact that there are so many steps that we have to take in order to ultimately produce that visualization, that analysis. And somehow we just make perhaps that the subject of the paper and leave behind all the other work that we have put in order to get there, right? That I think is doing disservice to ourselves, and two, perhaps doing disservice to our community, because the knowledge, the experience that we have, that we gain in the process of producing what is called the clean data set from the very even before you come to the data set, the entire problem of the OCR and the HDR is something that she has analyzed. But then after that, there's the very critical task of cleaning the data set, which is very important. And typically, we sort of it doesn't show up on the kind of work that we have done. And it's very, very important that we actually when we build, and because many of us who are engaged in this conversation today are are going to invest in students in the future, it is important for us to create that pathway so that in later times, I mean, one can sort of have a way to judge that work. But having said that, I mean, I think it's important here to we actually look at what's happening within the Indian academia and Indian DH, so to say. Though we're a country which is multilingual, at least there are 22 official languages, very well entrenched, sort of very rich heritage, literary heritage of their own. But the fact is that most of the DH scholars in India do come from, I'm willing to be corrected if that is wrong, come from a English literature background, right? So the Anglophonic sort of it's Anglophone heavy, if one may use the term that way. And there are two things out of here. One is, of course, the very important question of the OCR HDR, the question of how sort of how accurate the OCR HDR is. I'd just like to mention here, because I have been sort of thinking about this, and so we have now started a project here at IIT Delhi to actually develop a kind of an HDR platform. We're beginning with Urdu as a language, and we see whether we can move ahead to other languages in later years. Hopefully, we should be successful in that. But the question also is, how to develop that that kind of capability to be able to produce machine readable texts. The other important thing I wanted to, what seems to me to be important is that even though it is English, English usage is varied across different spaces. Different. I mean, the English that is used in India. I mean, when we look at tools or methods like topic modeling, for example. I mean, a topic modeling a trained data set may work very differently for picking up things from our Indian corpus than it would be perhaps from somewhere else. I would imagine that, and therefore it's important that we actually our scholarship actually interrogates the dominance of the Anglophone as well. Um, and uh, I just want to leave you with one more thought, and I would like to think of, I would like to invite your thoughts on this process. Is that in India we have a very important question. I mean, our politics sort of veers around this very important question. I mean, there are many questions in our politics, in national politics, in our national life. And one of the question is of language. Language is very central, and we know that even in the colonial times there was a politics of language, the separation, for example, between um, Hindi and Urdu as two different languages, something that is mediated by a technology like print with its rigidity. Whereas and we have now come down to 22 languages, but actually if you look at variants, there are many more possible languages which are now relegated as dialects or whatever. Now my question is, with certain tools like Transliterator, right? I mean, we in India today, we think of a link language. What is a link language? And for some people, it's either English or Hindi. Now, if languages could talk to each other with the kind of website that you have for the multilingual DH group, for example, which can be read across various languages, there are certainly challenges involved. But if tools like transliterators can be developed, then perhaps one can, even without learning the script, easily, certainly transliterate a Urdu document into a Hindi document, and therefore lead to a different kind of understanding of different cultures, bring people close together. There's no need for a bridge language. I mean, a Bangla text can possibly be transliterated in Tamil, producing far greater degree of cultural interchange than first waiting for it to be translated into the English and then to be translated into Oriya or some other language at all. So what, in your experience of multilingual DH internationally, do you think this kind of intercultural exchange, and therefore questioning the centrality of the Anglophone, really can, do you think DH can, and the digital media can sort of transcend some of the limitations that print historically has had over the last few centuries? Thank you for a very enlightening talk once again.
Thank you for the response. Yeah, no, it's been really interesting. I spend a fair amount of time on DH Twitter. I mean, especially during the pandemic, because it gets kind of lonely around here. But even outside of the pandemic, to kind of keep an eye on what's going on outside my immediate circles. Honestly, being on the west coast of the United States, the east coast can sometimes feel like very far away. So even on the same national level, it's been very useful to kind of track what's going on, follow live tweets of events that I can't possibly attend in person, and that's extended to these kind of international contexts as well, where the you can follow the conversations, the arguments, the debates in kind of what DH looks like in different cultural contexts, as long as you're willing to like do one extra click. There's a little like translate tweet button underneath, which like you know, I think that is a huge burden for people who are like, who aren't used to being exposed to other languages on a daily basis. Like they see other scripts and like things they can't read and kind of like freak out and move on. But if you can get over the hurdle of like literally like hit the, and all the caveats, you know, that you know, should go into machine translation and every, you know, the training and all of that. But, you know, it's enough. It's enough at this point to get a gist of like, what are the pressing issues, you know, and the ways in which, you know, it makes sense to have like, you know, international intercultural dialogue about it. You know, for the non-English DH class that I taught, I actually had, you know, I had students read an article in French, and most of them could not read French. You know, so I told them not only, you know, run it through Google Translate, but also look at the French, like spend some time using your eyeballs looking at the French, and compare that to the machine translation. Because, you know, with the machine translation, you lose things about like, you know, the debates about whether to call it, you know, digital humanities in English, you know, or a French translation of that term, and things like that. So I think there's a lot of possibility, particularly when it comes to, you know, if the burden is like alphabet transliteration, that doesn't always work. I mean, sometimes if there's like digraphs that could go both ways in terms of how it goes, I mean, it won't be perfect, but you know, it seems like computationally that's an easy barrier to remove, to make the experience of going from one language to another related one, you know, in a more familiar script, more like the experience of going from English to French.
I think that's, Professor Ghosh, if you'd like to respond, but I think that sort of opens the face for other questions as well. And I especially like the fact that this interchange brought about the politics of language, and Professor Ghosh talked about Hindi and Urdu. It's been there from imperial times. It was Pali and Sanskrit in the past. So that kind of conversation has been, you know, historically that's been true. So I'm very glad that Professor Sean Pugh from Michigan has joined us as well. And hi, Sean. Sean has a few questions. I think he's putting. So I want to ask him in person. Sean, you know, the floor is yours.
Oh, thanks so much. I want to hear from other people. Well, it's nice to meet you. I haven't. I don't think I've talked to any of you on Zoom before. So I was thinking, I really liked your talk, and I'm also I'm in Michigan State, and I've been working in the digital humanities for a while now. And one thing I've been wondering about, particularly for thinking about our for the research that's being done in Indian South Asian languages, do you think that there is space within the existing kind of landscape of digital humanities, journals, et cetera, for research in non-English languages? And or do you think that we should be thinking about, there's been a lot of moves in the places like Stanford as well for thinking about Asia or other kind of more types of DH that don't privilege English. And so, do you think that is something? Do you think there is an openness to DH work in say popular culture in Hindi or something like that, or within the Anglophone digital humanities, you know, whatever it is, configuration at the moment? Or do you think that, or what do you think? The other thing I'm interested in, we've been doing a lot of work in our group and thinking about transliteration and those issues, and I'm wondering if you've found anybody doing interesting theoretical work in that area as well.
Yeah, so on the topic of journals, I mean, I think one of the major advantages of kind of how DH work often tends to be written up is the way that it centers method rather than content. I mean, like it's common. It's already common, you know, especially at conferences, to have like a talk of people who maybe have like never heard of the thing that you're talking, like the content of like what your talk is about. And so there's like a blurb at the beginning where we're like, here's 90 seconds to get you up to speed on like 300 years of literary history. Now for the talk. You know, that you know, you actually have to train grad students in, because they're used to working in their disciplinary context where of course everyone's heard of this, you know, and you have to start from the beginning. So the fact that it is so method oriented makes me think that there's no reason why there wouldn't be a place for work on South Asian languages or really any other languages in general. I think increasingly there's a greater awareness, and honestly, there's been a lot of this push has been coming from kind of the European side of things, where this has led to some conflicts where there are sometimes these like sense of competing definitions of diversity, where the Europeans are inclined to say linguistic diversity and the Americans are inclined to say racial diversity. I think the answer needs to be both. But I think given that background, there's space for it. At the same time, we are seeing more the different constituent organizations of ADHO tend to have a journal. And so recently, the Humanistica started its, journal where all the articles are in French. I believe there's an Italian journal, there's a German journal. So if the focus is on kind of linguistic representation for the work to be done in that language, there probably is a need for a venue for that. But if it's DH work where the topic is in South Asian languages, I would say absolutely. In terms of theories of transliteration, yeah, I think I probably fall back on my caveat of like, theory is not my cup of tea, such as it is. I've mostly been looking at the challenges of doing it practically, where there isn't such a convenient like one-to-one. Like how bad is it really if you don't have a one-to-one mapping? Like things will get screwed up, but like how badly do they get screwed up? Has kind of been my take on it. But yeah, if I would be curious if you come across something.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I think I take a few comments and questions from the chat box as well. So just one more thing. I think Quinn had a shout out to Dr. Rukmini Pandey and her work on fanfic, and Rukmini is a friend and also a part of DHARTI. So again, a shout out to Rukmini's fantastic work on fanfiction. If you haven't looked at Rukmini's work, please go ahead and have a look at it. So Rohan has mentioned in the chat box that I have had more than satisfactory results with Kraken for Devanagari. To be honest, it took a fair amount of pre-processing to get a character rate of 99%. Kraken is a CLSTM-based open source engine currently at use for Arabic at Open Islamic Text Initiative, although it doesn't work at all on a multi-column layout, a feature under development. So Quinn, if you had any commentary on that.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I had heard of Kraken in the context of Arabic before, but I didn't know that it also works with Devanagari. That's fabulous.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rohan, for that comment. Then we have Shatarupa Mishra, who says that thank you for the interesting talk. When we have online archives of texts related to traumatic historical issues like the Holocaust or the partition of India, is there a danger of archives being selective rather than all-inclusive? And how could official interventions affect the construction of such archives? Just want to add on to Shatarupa's question. I think this idea of archives as exclusionary is a question all across the scholarship around archives. But I also want to sort of mention, Quinn, you've also talked about in your talk about stepping away from the normative understanding of archives and archiving. So if you could comment, or if you had any comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely they will be selective, and absolutely they have to be selective, because I mean, like even if you talk to the archivists, they will proudly point out that like they don't keep everything. And it's always based on somebody's judgment at the time. And I think we're sort of reaching the point in regards to discussions around data, especially any sort of data that relates to humans, where we're realizing that bias is not something that we're ever going to eliminate. Like bias is inherent, and sometimes the best that we can do is to try to manage it, to document it, to write down what was chosen and why, under which circumstances, what were the guidelines for choosing things. And in terms of expanding the perspective, it's difficult. It takes frankly time and money to grapple with large traumatic events where there is such a multiplicity of perspectives and stories and objects and everything. The kinds of, like, doing justice to those events through a singular archive, would be a phenomenal undertaking. There's there's a whole like museum with a large endowment in the US for the Holocaust, and so I would honestly discourage any one person from trying to take that on as their own project or even their own group's project. I mean, the scale that needs the scale of resources that you need to do that in any way right is tremendous. But instead, perhaps thinking about what story do you want to tell and what perspective do you want to capture, and being clear about that's where this project is situated, if that's what you want to work on, and just be clear about what the story is that you're telling and how you came to that, I think is really the best that one can do.
Absolutely. And I think as digital humanists, I think our understanding of archives is a little different from often that of library archivists. And I think there's a fantastic essay by Kate Thiemer, which says archives in context and as context, which I would also sort of put out there as something that's important to read, right? So I think we've gone past our time, and it's been over an hour. I have one more comment in the chat box, the two more actually. There's one commentary from Dr. Madan Babu, who says, language is cultural identity of an individual, and in a country like India, where language matters, putting a pressure on the use of a language which is spoken by majority could lead to cultural catastrophe. I think that's the idea of whether we, I think that's absolutely agreed on. And I think, Quinn, you just pointed that out, that hegemonic use of one language is problematic, especially in the multilingual sphere. I think there's one more question in the chat, in the question and answer box, which says, instead of making other languages behave a bit like English by creating a dictionary format, is there absolute alternative that will enable it to be usable in the digital formats? I think that's also something that Quinn's talked about with Tesseract, with transcribers. So I think I'm going to, yeah, sorry, Quinn, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, just briefly. I mean, like the purpose of making things be like English is that you can tap into all of the work that's already been done with English tools. But yeah, in an ideal world, building things that are specifically tailored for how an individual language works, I think would be an ideal.
Absolutely. So I also see Professor Arjun right now. He's just also got his names in different regional dialects and languages as well. So again, and I don't think we have any more questions in the chat box. Professor Ghosh, if there's a comment or a point that you would like to raise at this point.
No, I just wanted to bring to your notice that Tejpur University, Assam, their Assamese department has set up a paper in digital humanities.
Oh, wonderful.
Which is probably very, very important sort of development vis-a-vis moving DH in India outside the English domain.
It absolutely leads to that.
I think this is very, very welcome, and it will actually lead to that kind of institutional sort of belonging and investment, which we really need. And this can have wider implication from the way Indian academia actually functions. The fact that we still have an Anglophone, Anglo-centric sort of academia.
Right, and of course, I think something that Quinn also mentioned, that in Europe, there's also a different term being used for digital humanities. Professor Tania Clemens talks about this. So that's very interesting, that if we can take that, the word digital humanities can only be a starting point, which allows new practices that are focused on content, which Quinn, you talked about, right? So that's something that's very exciting. One of my colleagues from DHARTI, Professor Maya Dodd, who does fantastic work in archiving, who's in our attendees right now, who's just pointed out superb session. Thank you, Maya, and we are very fortunate to have you as part of a steering committee. Just wanted to acknowledge and shout out to your work she's doing at Flame. So again, without any further ado, Nirmala had to leave because she had something come up. So I'm going to do the vote of thanks again. So thank you, Quinn. Thank you, Professor Ghosh, Arjun. Thank you, Sean, for coming in. And I learned so much. I learned so much every time I listened to Quinn, but the discussions were amazing. And I'm so glad that Arjun and Sean took the time to come in. Thank you to all the attendees who came in with your wonderful questions. Dharti is what Maya, my colleague, says, it's grounded DH, right? So our DH is quite grounded. We currently don't have a lot of institutional funding, etc., going in our favor, but we are passionate about making DH a far more egalitarian project than a territorial project. That could happen in multiple ways. So thank you so much again for all of you for joining in. Thank you, Quinn. We are grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Take care and bye to everyone.
Bye.